Hey guys, this is Gerry O Audience reporting for Kids First. Now, I hope everyone is staying safe, but we have a very special guest today. Her name is Cynthia Hsiung. She is a director, a writer, a producer, a development executive. I love the name of that, development executive. I want to talk more about that. But she's extremely accomplished. She's made shows, she's made movies, she's worked for amazing studios like MTV, VH1, Fox Network, Warner Bros, and most recently, she's working with Alibaba. Cynthia, thank you so much for being on today. How are you doing today?
Sure. Thank you, Gerry. I'm doing great. As great as you can be being at home.
Absolutely, very true. Now, the first question I want to ask is, like I mentioned, right now you're working with Alibaba, the Chinese company. So can you talk a little bit about your day-to-day role? You're an executive producer, and I feel like everyone knows that the executive producer position exists, but basically only executive producers know what actually that job entails. So could you talk a little bit about what your day-to-day life is like at Alibaba?
Yeah, Alibaba is like China's Amazon, and they are doing programming through their distribution, which is Youku in China. And they began their first production company in Los Angeles about almost 2 years ago now. And I have been working with launching the Writers Room on their very first series that's written in America for a Chinese audience. And I think you were talking about the executive producer, and that's a title that is given to a number of people. And I have to say, everyone does something a little different. For me, with this series, what I'm doing is launching the writers' room, working with writers, getting everyone to work on it from a series perspective, and to get everyone on a proper writing rotation and schedule.
Now, you mentioned getting everything together for the writers' room for the series. Now, of course, film and TV are two different mediums, especially in the writing, because in TV, writing is a very, very powerful department. In film, not so much. In writing, they are royalty. So can you talk a little bit about what it is different in terms of the business side? How is it different between film and television?
Yeah, film is very much focused on one particular film at a time. So you're not shooting two films together with the same crew or the same writers or the same directors, for example. And you usually will do that under a large studio, and that will all be done with a large, schedule that can move around. If you're not going to hit a particular time frame for a part of the film, you have more flexibility with that. In television, though, you don't have as much flexibility, because if you go to air, for example, you really can't go to an hour worth of black. So you have to have something ready. Also, in the day, this time of streaming, you do have a little more flexibility, but even so, you're always working on multiple episodes all at once. So you're writing them all more or less together with different writers, sometimes the same. And so it's sort of a larger project that goes over a longer period of time when you're doing series.
I'm sure there's a lot of TV shows that
Does
have
that
been
make
running.
sense?
It does, it does. There's been a lot of TV shows that have been running for decades. I'm sure our audience knows a few of them. So it is very true what you say about timelines. Now, in terms of restraints, although TV can be restraining, what is even more restraining is children's content, because of the audience you have to target it for and what you have to build for. So how is it different working for children's content and for adult content?
That's a great question. For children's content, often you have an area at the network called Broadcast Standards and Practices, BS&P for short. And they are a part of the network that will oversee language, actions, storylines that are appropriate for children or not appropriate for children. So there is oversight on those storylines, a little bit more so than you would have for an adult series. Additionally, if you have a series that has advertising, then there is a little bit more eyes on that as well, because advertisers may not be so happy if something slips through the cracks and in their eyes is not appropriate for children. On the adult side, it depends a little bit in terms of if you are doing something on a cable channel, for example, or streaming service versus a network. The networks have advertisers, which means that there will be a little bit more of a issue of, will this be okay with the advertisers or not, versus streaming or cable, which has a little bit less of those regulation issues to deal with.
Hmm. For most people, in terms of thinking of audience and thinking of restrictions, it ends there. But for you specifically, it goes a step further because you also have to think about the cultural differences since you are working with both Chinese and American overheads and audiences. So how do you balance the two cultural differences? Because as much as we'd like to think it, China and United States do have a lot of cultural differences most people don't notice.
Yeah, absolutely. With this series with Alibaba, there is the thinking is it's first and foremost for a Chinese audience, and the storytelling is very different to me, who grew up in America and has only done American television up until this point. The Chinese audience, the storytelling, if I compare it, is a little bit slower paced. They like to draw out emotion a little bit more. They don't, it's not as an issue if something goes over a little bit in time, so long as they address the proper parts that they would like to. There are certain aspects of a young person's life that they pay a larger attention to. So for example, we can't portray a very young girl getting married and having children. It has to be above a certain age. So it's things like that that we've had to be very attentive to.
That's really interesting because, day-to-day lives in the United States, we don't notice what's culturally unique to us. And I'm sure that's the same for Chinese people as well. They don't notice what's normal for them until they see something that's different. And then that's when things start happening. So I'm sure that's a big, big struggle. But another thing that is a big struggle is writers starting out. It's generally a very hard medium to start out with because it's so fluid, it's so flexible. You're actually a professor at UCLA, an instructor at the Extension Writers Program. So could you talk a little bit about the mistakes and the lessons you see that beginning writers make and how they can solve them?
Sure. I think beginning writers usually think very big, and they have these ideas of whether it be, depending on the genre, if they're doing a genre where they're creating a its own universe is what we call it. So if they're creating something that's in outer space, or if they're creating something that's in a different planet or prehistoric times or period piece of any kind, then what often happens is they're thinking on that level first, and they're not really honing in and focusing on the storylines. So often that's one of the more common ones, where it's about focusing in on the storyline, focusing on character development, understanding how every storyline and character needs a beginning, middle, and end. Very often people have a beginning, they can have a middle, but it's the ending that sometimes is baffling to people.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. And speaking of movie worlds, those are becoming very common. I'm sure the audience knows what I'm talking about. They're becoming so common that it seems like movies are going into a TV realm where it's just a series of movies and these overarching plots lasting decades. And on the other side, TV is becoming more like films. I mean, when you watch HBO's shows and Showtime and Netflix, they're becoming more and more like movies. So how do you think TV and film are going to continue to blend in the future?
Yeah, they kind of have crossed over a lot. When I know that one of your questions was about when I started my career. I have to say it was very different, and even actors who did film didn't want to do TV back then, and vice versa. Now, yes, television is really where there's so much of a focus, and a lot of that is the business model for it, which is another part that often new writers or creators don't always think as much about. But there's a lot more money to be had in series creation at this point. It's a harder area to get the bang for the buck on a feature, which is also why you have to have these big tentpole movies like the Marvel movies, because those will almost guarantee a large audience. But if you're making just a one-off movie of characters that are brand new that people aren't as familiar with, then it's harder to make money at the box office these days. And we can see that from our Zoom communicating, right? People are watching things from home. They're watching things from their laptops, from all different screens. And that kind of viewing is really better with series and television streaming, et cetera, as well as we're binge watching, right? So we're sitting around watching 8 hours of something that we probably shouldn't be. But anyway, so, the binge watching culture is also taking over for sure.
As someone who just binge watched an 8-hour show on Netflix, I know exactly what you're talking about. Now, speaking of our situation as the well-eyed audience members may have noticed we are currently on Zoom. This is not an in-person interview, and you are actually writing a mini-series about what's going on in the world with the coronavirus 19 situation. So how do you tackle that subject? Because COVID-19 is something that's reaching all across the globe. Going back to China, it's going from China to the United States to Russia to everywhere on Earth. How do you take from that a single storyline to follow?
Yeah, the approach at the moment is as a mini series. It always has been for that reason. It started in January when I actually have a former student from Wuhan, and his parents were quarantined, and we started talking about this. He's also a development executive. And then I brought in a journalist, and we all started to work together. And we decided to sort of divide and conquer, and we were dividing up storylines. We don't have a third act yet. We may not have even reached the midpoint just yet for certain areas. But the hope is that we will portray different storylines from different parts of the world and integrate it all together, and hopefully portray a lot of different stories going on about what we're all experiencing right now.
Hmm. You know, I really like that because I felt when the news started coming out that we were more like a community now as a society, as a global society. You can start feeling what people in Wuhan are feeling, even if you're here in Los Angeles, because it's impacting us all. We're all in this together, and I love that the miniseries reflects that. Now, speaking of being all in it together, the film industry is definitely going through a very unique situation right now with COVID-19. Productions are basically impossible in this situation, and when no production is happening, it's really hard to even have a film industry. So how do you think the industry will adapt to this new lifestyle under COVID-19?
It's a really great question. It's still unfolding. I can tell you what I am seeing. I'm seeing a lot of people furloughed. I'm seeing a lot of people moving what they can home to work. I have family members who are in the industry, and we're all moving things home to be able to do what we can. But you're right about productions are halted. There isn't a safe place in the globe right now, on the planet, to really be shooting. But I'll tell you what I think will probably happen is, for example, what we're doing right now. There is a development executive or two or three somewhere around that's thinking of exactly something like, gee, how can we make a series with something like Zoom? How can we make a series with what's going on in the world and use technology to do that? So there will be a changing way that we tell stories. There always has been. Anytime technology or what is happening in the world has come into play, the creative minds, such as yourselves, will be coming into it all and deciding, well, gee, I could make a series with using Zoom right now. I could do a reality series about what's going on with my whole family if I wanted to. So I do think there will be different types of shows and movies. They're just brewing right now in creative minds.
Hmm. You know, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of amazing film festivals going on right now where people are so creative, making 30-second, 1-minute shorts just to get the creative juices flowing, as they say. And now, something that a lot of people still struggle with while under this situation is being productive, being creative. So for people who are trying to still be productive, or even our fellow Kids First members, we have 5 other critics on the call today. What tips would you give them to still be able to be productive, be creative, and keep developing themselves in many ways despite the COVID-19 situation?
This is, in my mind, this is an ideal situation to be creative. Anything in life that has sort of restrictions, even if you had a production that had restrictions, that is when the most creative parts of our minds come out. And I think there's some great storytelling that is brewing in people's minds right now. I mean, I think we all, for example, I'm just going to use a popular movie, World War Z. I think you probably, right? I believe that started brewing out of the SARS, virus of the early 2000s. So I'm sure there's a lot of people thinking of different, this is inspiring different storytelling, different story ideas. And so I think it's a great time to hone in on storytelling skills, learning how to write a screenplay, learning the craft of screenplay writing. And also things like learning the craft of using a video camera, learning the craft of editing. So much of that has to be done at home anyway, or is learned a lot on our own at home. So I think it's really a great time to hone in on those skills.
Very, very true. Now, one last question I want to ask you before we go on to opening it to all our film critics is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, you are a development executive, and for all those great ideas that we have that we're writing about the COVID-19 situation, just in general, what can a development executive do, or what does a development executive does in order to get it from a script onto an actual finished product?
Okay, so speaking as from the standpoint of a development executive, if I see a screenplay that I adore, feel like this is such a winner, and I want to take it to the next level, one of the main things that I have to be willing to do is to pitch it to my boss or to my colleagues, and I have to be willing to continue to pitch it and continue to pitch it and continue to pitch it. So when a writer brings me a script that they want me to believe in, the one thing to sort of get across is that the writer needs to really believe in it, because the writer needs to be supplying me with the materials to then push it forward from there, if that makes sense. So very often the script is great, but it might want to be accompanied with some presentation materials. It might want to have what we call a lookbook, a series Bible, sometimes even a piece of video that might really display what they're going for.
Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for talking to all of us about your career and your many lessons. I think we've all taken something from this to think about in our own lives. And before I close it, I just want to give the opportunity for all our amazing film critics and me myself to say thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to see your names in lights in just a few short years, maybe even sooner.
Well, thank you so much. For our audience, make sure to check out the amazing work that Cynthia is doing, as well as stay tuned for the COVID-19 mini-series she is working on, as well as the Alibaba series she is working on, which is going to be announced in 2020. I'm your host, Gerry O, signing off. Bye!